Dear students, today we are briefly going to discuss a topic entitled Asiatic Mode of Protection, Sankritization and the Coastal Models, Theoretical Reflections. This particular presentation was part of Father Susai Endowment Lecture, and I am trying to reproduce that here for your benefit. In the introductory part, let us try to understand what is Asiatic mode of protection. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels used it in their writings, and it denotes stagnant villages characterized by self-sufficiency, wherein protection and consumption is made within the village itself. The tools as such are simple, and therefore the life of the people is also simple. Though I am briefly trying to give a gist of what is Asiatic mode of production, much ahead of what has been discussed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, utilitarian historians such as Thomas Macaulay and James Mill, they have also discussed about these self-sufficient villages. They found that the villages are stagnant, and through law alone this stagnation could be disturbed and it could be integrated with. But both the theories of Asiatic mode of production and the views of utilitarian historians are not fully right, because there were rulers who relied upon these villages for taxes, and the headman of the village, he collected the taxes and produced it to the state. When armies crossed these villages, they were supplied with food, and also when there were famine, the rulers exempted villages from taxation. And welfare measures such as cleaning of ponds and supplying of water were the responsibility of the rulers. However, utilitarian historians, they were of the opinion that these were oriental despots who, on the basis of huge taxation, collecting huge taxes, then only they provided the facility of water for the purpose of cultivation. These utilitarian historians, their main contribution is that they divided Indian history into ancient, medieval, and modern. They helped to arrive at such a division, but they divided that into Hindu India, Muslim India, and British India. So they projected ancient India as one of a golden age. Rather, the Muslim age is a darker one, and this darker one is being now corrected by the rule of the British, and therefore they attempted to divide and rule the people by vaguely conceptualizing about the Indian past. But these were questioned by an eminent sociologist named M.N. Srinivas in 20th century. He brought out certain important ideas such as Sankritization, Westernization, and dominant caste. These are popular sociological concepts that explain social stratification. So basically, every people in the lower rank, they tend to imitate the people of the higher layer. Thus, the Vaishyas, they imitate the Kshatriyas, and the Kshatriyas, they try to imitate the Brahmanas, and the Shudras, they try to imitate the practices of all other dominant castes or the upper Varnas. So the castes are not stagnant, they are in a state of flux. When all other castes are trying to imitate the practices of the Brahmins, they attempted to imitate the behaviors of the people in power. Some of the Sultanate rulers themselves were Brahmins. Saints, for instance. And when British people, when they captured power, they, that is the Brahmins, they imitated their practice, took to Western education, and they occupied the first employment opportunities provided by Western education. Although Sankritization and Westernization are the common practice, the idea of dominant caste emerges in a place where there are no Brahmins. There are certain villages or certain locations, regions where Brahmins were minority and other castes tend to dominate. For instance, in Andhra Pradesh, Reddis claim superiority over Brahmins. At that stage, people tend to imitate the practices of the Reddis rather than the Brahmins. So that is what the idea of dominant caste tend to explain. If a sociologist is trying to provide a model based on Sankritization, Westernization, and dominant caste, a historian by name Gopinath Ravindran, he attempts to give a completely different theoretical framework. He states that these Brahmins, they accumulate land ownership through service to the rulers, and they populate the cities, and they are the absentee landlords, and they provide the management right to subordinate castes which are not untouchables and they are above untouchables. For instance, in the case of Tamil Nadu, they are predominantly Shudras. These Shudras, they live in villages and they till the soil on behalf of the Brahmins, and they give a huge share to the Brahmins as their share, and they provide a very little share to the actual tillers, and they also accumulate a substantial quantum of the produce. What has been actually produced in the village, the Brahmins does not know, and what is actually their wage, the people who tilled the soil, they do not know, and substantial quantum of property or profit has been accumulated by the middle class, and they became dominant in the villages and rural places. For the kind of service that has been provided by the Shudras, they are provided a right of entry into the temples, whereas the actual tillers, they have to stand outside the temple and they can only listen the Kada Kalatsheba conducted by the temple during festival times, and they do not have access to Vedas or Brahmanas or other kind of Vedic text, but they can listen to the epics. Thus, the actual tillers are subordinated and they were arrested with the soil. Let us try to compare the self sufficient villages with what is present now. One of the major theorists of contemporary India is Ashish Nandi, who states that caste riots have taken place only in cities, and villages have largely been peaceful places because they respected mutual boundaries. He puts forth such an argument in his book Intimate Enemy. The division of labor of a village is such that they mutually respected their boundary. So, need is central than accumulation in a village. In a village, there were washermen, barbers, carpenters, and others, and a share of the produce was given to them based on their need rather than their service value calculated in terms of money. The introduction of money was only made by the British people, and they introduced the market wherein this produce of the village has to be taken and has to be encashed. Until then, the villages were self sufficient and largely peaceful. Whether they ate full stomach or not, but they were largely peaceful. The factors of protection and forces of protection were available within, and these were amicably controlled by the people of the village themselves. The introduction of markets it grossly affected the lives of the people, and market value has been fixed also for land, and while dividing the land among the successors of a family, this kind of value, money value, it created a lot of problem, and selfishness entered into harmonious villages based on self sufficiency. Moreover, we have to understand that local governance was more powerful, and the Oriental despots theory became very vague. As stated in another lecture, Buttonstein's concept of segmentary state is very important in this context. The inscriptions of Uttarameru they give a completely different picture, and it states that the local self government is more powerful and the decisions made in the villages were respected by the imperial rulers themselves in the Chola regime. Ur, Sabha, Nadu, etc., they had adequate freedom and they enjoyed enormous power in decision making. Similarly, guilds like Nagaram, Ayyavol, etc., they also had sufficient autonomy and they at times even served as power centers and lobbying agents over and above the government. In fact, M.N. Srinivas Sankritization model has to be deeply viewed in this light. So, how Ur, Sabha, Nadu and guilds like Nagara Mayavol they had impacted the concept of Sankritization has to be widely viewed. However, the state justified absentee landlordism and landowners seated in cities they were patrons of the industrialization of that time. So luxury articles were produced and these absentee landlords were the consumers of that. The economically deprived sections of the society were also socially and culturally relegated to the background. And therefore, as Yogendra Singh, another sociologist, attempts to state, literal tradition and great tradition they evolved in villages and cities respectively. Both are independent of each other, and little tradition had some impact on it emerging from the great tradition. Most of the village gods are thought to be minor forms of the great tradition. To be very clear, a village god by name Ayyanar might be a reflection of Lord Shiva or Vishnu. So these people could not directly venerate Lord Shiva or Vishnu, rather they may have their own god, their own priest, and they tend to imitate the practice of the upper caste by saying that this god an incarnation of the greater gods. All these matters that has been discussed so far are commonly applicable for agricultural villages. Now let us shift to the coastal model. So coastal model, it has to essentially begin with the interpretation of P.T. Srinivasa Iyengar on Thinai. In Tolkappiyam, 5 Thinais have been discussed. They are Kurinji, Mullai, Marudam, Neidal and Palai. Applying the evolutionary theory to this particular concept of Tolkappiyam, P.T. Srinivasa Iyengar attempts to state that human evolution started in the hills and therefore the birthplace of civilization, as far as the Tamils are concerned, it is the hill region. So, from there, according to P.T. Srinivasa Iyengar, I am saying this, from there they started moving towards Mullai, which is the forest area where they served as hunters. So, nextly, from there they developed their tools and they entered into agriculture and fertile lands were created. These fertile lands are called Marudam. So, complexity of tool made them enter into Neidal region, that is the coastal region, where they created boats and they entered into the sea not only for catching fish but also to reach foreign nations for the purpose of trade, overseas trade. But available archaeological sources state that human movement, it started from Mullai region where river water is available. It is grossly between Mullai or Marudam and not Kurinji, because man is dependent on water first rather than climate. At this juncture, it is pertinent to clarify that any of these 4 forms, if they lose their nature, then Palai region is evolved. Palai is predominantly deserts, but we do not find proper deserts in the Tamil country. Rather, we have to understand that those regions which did not yield adequate benefit are called Palai region. However, as P.T. Srinivasa Iyengar pointed out, coastal settlements are marked by complex tools. There were nets, boats, and other gadgets that enable them to carry on their everyday living. And the general trend in the coastal settlement is not self sufficient villages. They have to rely for main food from fertile plains. The agrarian surplus produced in the Marudam region reached the Neidal region, and maybe in barter they took back fish caught by the fisherman. So, we also come across evidence of Sangam age stating that there were pearl fishing enterprise successfully being made in the coastal villages, for which Rome and Greek traders they came. So coastal villages they generated a large quantum of wealth, and Marco Polo in the 12th century he states that the pearl fishery coast is one rich place which has no parallel in any other part of the world. Eminent historian Champakalakshmi attempted to identify some of the trade routes, but as far as the pearl fishery coast is concerned, similar attempt has not been adequately made. Marco Polo states about the trade route in a crude manner, and he points to the legal system wherein a person who rests in the road is protected by the police system of that day. So, if a person is taking rest during nights in the road, his property is the responsibility, the safety of his property is the responsibility of the police people around the area. Whereas if he diverts his path and goes elsewhere, then police people are not responsible for any kind of theft. And Marco Polo also speaks about the kinds of donkeys available in the region with weak leg. So, if at all you find from the coastal region towards the Achangoil and Aryangavu Pass, you can find a lot of pillared halls named mandapams, and these mandapams and chatrams, for instance, Veeramudaliyar Chatram, these chatrams they supported the traders in their movement and they fed these people on their path. There were places like Malayalamedu within Tirunelveli, which denotes the presence of Kerala traders at that region. So Tirupati Marudur also bears evidence to Arab traders arriving at the coast. Tirupati Marudur is a temple which is some 70-80 kilometers away from the coast, but it has painting of Arab traders reaching there. Thus, coastal villages are linked with the major towns and villages and also cities, and they are not isolated or just self sufficient as we find in agrarian places. In conclusion, what we can effectively say is, if at all we adopt an epistemological approach that stands on the premise of limits of knowledge, we tend to pose the question of expansion of further queries based on a perceived food security. Of late, based on new age tools, societies appear to be in war with themselves. The birth of newness in social sciences corresponding with technology remains a huge challenge, and these days many people they tend to state that there had been a continent named Lemuria which was populated by the Tamils, and we have to start from such perceptions available throughout literature from the ancient period. However, archaeologists like Selvakumar they tend to state that there had been conversion of the local population, and this local population of Neolithic and Megalithic they from stage to stage converted, and he states that there are adequate material evidence to state that these people converted from one stage to another stage and adapted new technologies and evolved new cultures. But in the popular perception, there was no adequate support for such views. Therefore, there is an urgency to collect folklore and cross examine that with literary and archaeological sources. Particularly in the context of the coast, there has been constant contact with foreign countries, and new patterns tend to evolve from time to time. And one such pattern is conversion of religion, based on which new cultures evolved in the region. Therefore, in the coastal context, the Asiatic mode of protection is not fully present. Similarly, Sankritization is also not fully applicable to the coastal context, for there were multiple dominant groups including traders, priests, foreigners, so on and so forth, and therefore a strict Sankritization is also not found in the coastal region. So, coastal models are very different, unique, and they are multi layered and they have to be understood in a very different basis. With this, I conclude my lecture on Asiatic mode of production, Sankritization, and the coastal models: theoretical reflection. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.